Great. And next we have Gary.
Thanks, Jeremy. Well, I think I'll be speaking to a couple of the points that are being scrolled up at the moment. I would say that another bit of good news, really from a macro or a top-down standpoint, is where we are in the economic cycle. The economy is doing quite well at the moment, growth respectable by recent standards. We expect that to hold up through the better part of this year. A yellow flag out there is the recent backup in interest rates. We're experiencing that as we speak. Interest rates have moved up quite a bit this morning. The stock market is under pressure. But going forward, we think that the rise in inflation driving the rise in interest rates will be fairly modest, and we really don't see the economy posing or creating a big headwind for the industry, getting a tailwind from energy demand generally, and that should provide a reasonably good backdrop, we think, for the industry and for energy consumption. On the tariffs themselves, I would say that this is really part and parcel of what many of us call a Jekyll and Hyde economic policy. The Jekyll part, the good part, being the tax cuts, the lighter regulatory touch that have been supporting the strong rally in the stock market, providing some strength to the overall economy as well. The Hyde part is the administration's bias toward these trade restrictions and, at least on economic grounds, immigration controls. The solar tariffs, really a good example of trade restrictions, we think keying on a highly visible industry target, the solar cell industry, on seemingly justifiable grounds to counter Chinese subsidies and other incentives, but to the detriment of other parts of a broader industry and to a marginal extent, I think, the economy as a whole. A more difficult, perhaps, but economically viable approach would be to, rather than keying on the import side, to simply put pressure on China and other exporters to eliminate some of these market distorting measures. Given the nature of the solar industry in particular and the energy industry in general, the negative impact on the overall solar industry, I think, could very well be aggravated by unintended consequences that could add to the negative impact on the economy. For starters, anything added to the installed cost of solar energy risks a rotation by consumers into fossil fuels. That trend may, in fact, be favored by the administration based on some of their comments about coal, natural gas, oil, and the like. Losses to the industry at home and from reduced competitiveness in the global market could have at least a twofold effect, at least in theory, on industry jobs. First, to the extent that it hurts the more labor-intensive installation and other ancillary services in the solar industry, that could work against employment. In fact, that probably is a core assumption behind these net job losses of about 23,000 in 2018 alone. And second, any loss of competitiveness can encourage the solar cell and other manufacturers in the solar industry to substitute equipment for labor to maintain competitiveness, and that would weigh on employment as well. There's also the larger global trade issue, getting away from the solar industry, of aggravating trade tensions with China, perhaps inviting retaliation from them and other manufacturers. China is only a small direct exporter of solar panels at the moment. I think by some estimates about 10%. But the Chinese companies are very active in some of the other Asian economies, South Korea and Malaysia, with heavy involvement by Chinese companies that are still benefiting from state support. So there is a sizable indirect impact of these imports on China. And lastly, taking the longer view, there's, I would say, in terms of policy, and this could be another positive, nothing is forever, particularly these days in economic policy. Given the polarization in Washington, fiscal, regulatory, and other policies have swung back and forth over the past couple of decades as political control in Washington has become more polarized. And there's really no reason why that can't extend to trade policy if the Democrats do regain control of at least one house in Congress this November and ultimately the presidency, we could see an effort to turn back some of these trade restrictions, along with some of the fiscal policy measures and maybe even some of the changes in healthcare policies. So taking the longer view, this is still a very fluid situation from the top down. With that, let me turn it over to Vincent Ambrose from Canadian Solar. Vincent?